Hello everyone, welcome to the latest video in the 172nd Air Wing series. This is going to be a full review of the Mig-19, also known as, in this case, the Shenyang J-6. Now, before we get into the nuts and bolts of the review, I'd like to take a moment and offer a thank you to everyone who has subscribed to my channel. Thank you for your feedback and your input. It's been fun making these videos. Unfortunately, it's also time consuming to make these videos because I have to arrange time to read the source material, look at the books, read the information, compare sources, etc., etc. And that kind of thing, just as a matter of reality, takes time, and it takes more time than I'd like, but this channel is operating on a staff of one, aka just me. So here we are. I'm going to put some dedicated time into making more of these on a much more regular basis than I have been. A lot of life event things have happened that have blocked me from having the time to do these videos. So thank you for your patience and your understanding and your support. It is definitely appreciated, and please reach out with any feedback or general items to point out about my videos or the models or the history or any of those types of things, because we're all better knowing more and sharing that information. So with that, let's get into the fun stuff, which is the Panzerkampf J-6 in the video. So the J-6, as many of you watching this are well aware, is a licensed production version of the Soviet Union's Mig-19 interceptor slash fighter. So this aircraft was originally engineered and first took flight in 1956. So this is a technological contemporary to the North American F-100, which, as I'm sure most of you watching this are aware, was the first supersonic jet fighter for the United States. So what the F-100 represented as the first supersonic fighter in US service, the Mig-19 represented for the Soviet Union. So in 1957, the Chinese production company Shenyang received a license from the MiG Bureau in Russia to produce their own version of the Mig-19. Now, this was consistent with several other countries that flew the type, such as Czechoslovakia. They also got a license to produce a locally built variant. I believe that one is called the S-199. So if I ever get my hands on a Panzerkampf model of that, we'll probably talk more about that one too. But back to the J-6, Shenyang got the license in 1957. However, there were some production issues affecting the quality of the aircraft, which led to the first service date being sometime between 1959 and 1964. The dates are a little bit fuzzy because we're working with sources based on information from a society that doesn't exactly believe in freedom of the press. So if you do happen to know more detail about the service dates of this airplane or any of the information I mentioned here, please jump in the comment section and point it out for the entirety of anyone who watches this video and myself, because again, we're all better off with knowing the truth and the information of what we're doing. At least that's just what I believe. Call me crazy. So after the introduction of the J-6, this aircraft actually had quite an active service history, which as a Western aviation fan took me by surprise, because I would like to say most airplanes that are known in the aviation space have earned a place as being a famous aircraft, like for example the F-4s that I've talked about on this channel before, the F-14, some of the Russian types like the Mig-23 and the Mig-21, which I haven't gotten to a Mig-21 video yet, but I will at some point talk about that one, because those aircraft have a long history and people generally know about those. But the Mig-19 series seems to kind of languish in the shadows, even though it had a pretty active service history in and of itself, especially in the guise of foreign operators like the Chinese. So the Middle Eastern variants also had an interesting service history too, but again, I'll talk about those if and when Panzerkampf comes out with some Egyptian and Iraqi Air Force, in Egyptian Air Force Mig-19s, hint, hint. So in any event, back to the J-6 again, the J-6 had quite the service history during the 50s and the 60s because of two distinct skirmishes slash conflicts, we might say. While China was not openly at war with Taiwan, they did have quite a few skirmishes in the 1950s and the early 60s, and during those skirmishes, the J-6 did feature in those interactions. So the first set of skirmishes involved an interaction between the Taiwanese Air Force, which effectively operated U.S. types in kind of a, I won't say don't ask, don't tell basis, but more like a proxy state dynamic where we would post or deploy RF-101 reconnaissance aircraft, which I think I've talked about in my Voodoo series earlier. So check that out if you want to know more about the F-101s. But there were a series of RF-101s stationed in Taiwan that were maintained by the United States and flown by Taiwanese pilots. And the objective of these missions was kind of a win-win for both the Taiwanese and the U.S., right? These reconnaissance flights would overfly Chinese territory. Obviously, this was a violation of their aerial sovereignty, but these missions would take pictures of Chinese airfields and air bases and so forth. And of course, the Taiwanese benefited from this information, and I'm sure a copy or two found its way to Washington in the process. So some of these reconnaissance flights, most of them were not successfully intercepted. However, two of them were intercepted by J-6s, and two of those Voodoos were shot down. So already in Chinese service, the J-6 had a pretty active history. And then in 1967, we have what happens in Southeast Asia. And I call it Southeast Asia because, well, it's what the Air Force calls it too, but predominantly because when the U.S. was involved in Southeast Asia, it wasn't just Vietnam itself. And this is a point that I want to take a moment to explain, because sometimes when other people talk about Vietnam and the U.S. involvement, the focus is strictly on what happened in the countries, the former countries, I should say, of South and North Vietnam. But the Southeast Asian theater involved a lot more places than just the Vietnam area directly. Obviously, it involved Laos, it involved Cambodia, and it also involved, to some extent, aircraft crossing paths in China. So in one case, a flight of A-6 intruders in 1967 bombed a target that was about 4 miles south of the Chinese border. And based on the sources, what apparently happened is the A-6 flight took a right turn to get out of the target zone, but the flight leader hadn't paid attention or didn't realize that 2 of the 4 airplanes were in North Vietnam, but 2 of the airplanes on the outer edges of the flight had strayed into Chinese airspace. And when that happened, a pair of J-6 aircraft, very similar to the one you see in front of you, were vectored behind the A-6 intruders, and 2 of the intruders were shot down. So already, again, I mean, this is a situation, an event that most people don't associate necessarily with Vietnam because it didn't involve the Vietnamese Air Force, it involved China. But again, the Southeast Asian theater involves a lot more than just Vietnam. So these 2 A-6s were shot down as a result of this conflict, and this was a story I accidentally tripped over when doing some research for this video. So yeah, there was a declassified file that referenced it and a Chinese source that referenced it, and that's it. So again, if any of y'all watching this have other information that can fill in the blanks on some of these stories and how they happen, please share it, because I think we can all agree that there's enough disinformation and myths in the world, you know? So the other thing that happened in 1967 is a J-6 shot down an F-4. So this event is one that, unfortunately, I'm not sure what happened. And I say that because the sources seem to conflict with, well, they just straight up conflict with each other. The only thing that the sources agree on is that an F-4C was shot down in June 1967 by a Chinese fighter jet. And past that, we don't really get much more clarity behind the incident. So the Chinese version of events is that the F-4 strayed into Hainan Island airspace deliberately, was engaged by a pair of J-6s, and it was shot down. So the American version is that the F-4C was making a routine maintenance flight from the Philippines to South Vietnam and was ambushed by a pair of J-6s. So to me, I looked at the map of it, and the flight path from the Philippines to South Vietnam doesn't come close to Hainan Island, so it's kind of interesting that the F-4 that's gone a maintenance trip back and forth would end up over Hainan Island. And the U.S. reports didn't cite any navigational issues like what we would see later with a J-6 shoot down involving an F-104, American F-104, I should say. But yeah, that incident's a little funny because the stories don't line up. And again, there's only a limited number of sources that even mention this incident happening. So it is, however, important for today's video because that shoot down is what this Panzerkampf model is designed after. So this is the aircraft that took the shots that shot down that F-4C, and the inscriptions that you see on the wings here, I'm not going to butcher what it says there. I'm not going to make this an incident of how much I can butcher Chinese statements here, but essentially the inscriptions on the side, if I understand the sources right, are referencing glory to Chairman Mao and death to intruders. So there's also on the other side of the model, you'll see this in the other shots too, but on this side as well, you'll see a red star symbolizing that shoot down of that F-4. So yeah, it's interesting that one side says that the F-4 was just shot down minding its own business, and the other side says that the F-4 was actively in Hainan Island starting trouble. And it's interesting that the Chinese, which is not at this time period of culture known for being exuberant with their design philosophy, went to the trouble to repaint the J-6 involved in such a resplendently beautiful color scheme that you see here. So usually on these aircraft, they're all silver, and there's just a little number here that signifies the aircraft number, but apparently in this event, there was cause for artistic license on the part of the Chinese. So I'm happy that they actually did that, because this is a pretty cool looking airplane, even if you're not necessarily a fan of the Chinese or kind of that geopolitical side of the Iron Curtain, I guess. But yeah, apparently that was how that incident went down, and I guess it's up to you, the viewer, to decide which version makes sense or if neither version makes sense. So I will simply relay what I found, and we can discuss further, I guess, in the comment section. So with that, we will transition into talking about the model traits. So the J-6, this Panzerkampf rendition of the J-6, I think is pretty darn nice. I did build I want to say it's a Czechoslovak kit. I think it's KP is what they called. I built a KP J-6 in Soviet Air Force colors. I think I want to say 2 months ago, 3 months ago. And compared to that model, this is pretty much on point. The details are on point, the nose and the proportion of the cockpit, and the details here, like the size of the nose and the pitot tube relative to the fuselage, and the wing references here where you see the wing width here and the angle of the wing, and the weights, the flutter weights on the stabilizers as well. All those details are pretty much on point, and I call that out here because I had a Terabo Mig-19, and that was a hot mess of an airplane in 1/72 scale. I think they are literally the only other option in 1/72 diecast for a J-6 / Mig-19, and the nose on that was too long. The cockpit was way too small. There was zero detail in the cockpit whatsoever, and there were no guns. And to make matters worse, their missiles, which were located here and here, were way too big, as well as the landing gear. So there were some scale issues involved with it. When you put it on display next to like an F4 or something, it became painfully obvious that it really was like, it may have said 1/72 scale on the box, but the Terabo Mig-19s are like 1/79 scale or something weird. They're just too big. Whereas the proportions on this Panzerkampf are right on point. So bravo to them on that. So we can put that down for a plus. The model dimensions, it is 7.5 inches wide it's 7.5 inches long, which is going from the pitot tube here all the way to the engines right here. It's 5 just a little under 5 inches, like 4.8 inches width. So we're going from the wingtip here to the wingtip there. And it is 2.5 inches from the top of the stabilizer here to the rudder here to the ground. And that is the tallest point on the airplane. So again, in terms of scale, it's pretty much proper. You can display it with other models of 1/72nd scale, and it's not going to look weird or too big or awkward like the Turbo equivalent that's out there now. So bravo to Panzerkampf on that. The small parts. So this is another good thing to talk to about this model. The small parts here that you see, like the landing gear covers here, these, this, and this right here, they all attach magnetically, as do the external fuel tanks right here, and then one on the other side. You can't see it, but it's on the other side there, as well as the landing gear, which is right there as well. So the nose landing gear and the wing landing gear, the main landing gear, that's all magnetically attached, and Panzerkampf has done a great job of keeping the balance really good on this, meaning when you put the magnetic parts on this model, they don't attach. They're not so stiff that you can't take them off the model if you need to. However, they're not so loose that they fall off the model either, which is generally a problem that I have encountered with other brands in magnetic parts, because the magnetic parts on those just seem to just be way too loose, where the tolerances are weird. So you put it on and it sits crooked because the magnet comes out of position. Or I think I had one model that the magnet detached completely. And I think it was one of my Caliber Tomcats where the magnet, no, it wasn't a Caliber. I have to scratch that. It was a Century Wings F-14 where I had to glue the magnet back into the model because the landing gear magnet had come out of the airplane with the landing gear, which is not how it's supposed to work. So I had to fix that. I'm glad to say that at this point with this Panzerkampf model, I have not had any of those magnetic issues involved. I will say that you might have noticed that I did put some plastic here. It shows up on camera a little bit more than it does when you have it on the model, but I found that unfortunately with these tabs here, I had to put these on because the covers right here are for the wing. When you take the landing gear out, there's just a gap that's actually pretty well defined, and you put this cover in place and it makes it look like the airplane is it's ready to show in flight. So you can display this on the ground like you see here or in flight without an issue. However, this is completely flush with the wing once it is installed. So because it's flush with the wing once it's installed, when you want to take these out to display it on the ground again, you basically have to like take this little plastic tool that they put with the model and you got to like scratch at it to get it out of the well, because the magnet does such a good job of keeping it in place that unless you have some kind of pull tab like this right here, you're just not going to be able to get it out. You won't have enough leverage to get the covers off of the airplane because the magnet will be too strong. So I did put those covers, those little plastic, I just took some Scotch tape and stuck it on there, and it's clear tape. So it shows better on camera than it really does in real life. In real life, you barely notice it unless you're deliberately looking at the model, and that just made it easier for me to install and remove the landing gear and the covers when I was doing some of the shots you've seen earlier in this video, because otherwise, like the first time I took it off and put it on, it was just such a pain to take the covers off because they're flush, and when they're flush, it's like stealth fighter panel flush. There's no room to get anything in there to take these out. So pro tip, I would offer the advice to Panzerkampf that they should probably put a little just put a little spot someplace where you can put a tool in to pull these out, because otherwise you're just going to be, there's no leverage. You can't get them out of the model. So I don't know if I wouldn't call that necessarily a con. That's just, hey, they just did such a good job of putting the tolerances in the magnets and how they set that up that there's just no room to get it out. So make of that what you will, but be advised that is something to consider when you have this one. So the magnetic parts, really well done. The pitot tube right here, this comes out of the box separate. You actually take this out of the separate plastic packaging and attach it, which is good. Just because this is frightfully easy to break if you're not careful, which I found out the hard way on my KP model. So treat that with respect. Also, when you're handling the model, make sure that you're careful about the anti-flutter weights on the side right here. So the one here and the one here. It is unfortunately very easy to bend those because they've modeled them accurately to the actual airplane, which means if you pick it up by the tail and you're not careful, you can very easily bend them. So bear that in mind. Again, it's not necessarily a flaw. That's just something to keep in mind when you're handling it. There's also like other antenna, like the IFF aerial right here. There's another antenna right there that you can see that's painted in red. So when you're handling this model, try to take care of what you're doing because you can break something. So another feature that it has is it has deployable air brakes. You can't see it from this angle, but the two air brakes on the back, the one here and the one here, they're quasi-spring loaded, so you can prop them open or keep them closed. And then there's an air brake in the belly, which is also accurately modeled. It's generally underneath the airplane right about there. You can pull it out, not pull it out, but you can take that little plastic tool right here and you can just push it out, push the little speed brake out, and you can display the model with all three speed brakes deployed, which is really nice. And bravo again to Panzerkampf for including that detail. Another good detail to cover is the cockpit. They painted it blue, which is something they did not do on the prototypes they released on Facebook. So good job there. The cockpit's painted blue. There is no instrument panel, which I would put down as one of the flaws. Unfortunately, the way I look at it, I think it's just a matter of there's just not enough room. When you do the scale correctly and you have the cockpit size correctly, there just isn't enough room in the airplane to have an instrument panel, and you wouldn't see much anyway, especially with the pilot installed. So to keep enough room in the aircraft model to where you can actually put the pilot in or take them out, something probably had to give, and that was the cockpit. So there's no panel in front where you would have like your instruments and the little white stripe. That's like your centering stripe. Like the forward instrument panel is not in the airplane, but when you put the pilot in, you can't see it anyway. So I would just point that out so you're aware, but frankly, it's not a big concern for me because the rest of the cockpit is well done. The ejection seat, as you can plainly see, has a lot of detail, as does the canopy. Now the canopy does slide. You can slide that forward or you can slide it back. I'm not going to do it in this video because unfortunately it's very stiff. I actually was concerned that I was going to break the model when I tried to open it the first time, because mine, maybe your example, if you order it from, you order yours at the time you do, maybe Panzerkampf will have this sorted out when you watch this video. But for this one, for this particular model, that canopy is very, very stiff. I was afraid I was going to break it actually when I used that tool right here to get between the canopy and the canopy bow. I had to take that little tool, put it basically right here, and then wedge it open. And once I got it started right about there, it slid pretty easily out. So the canopy does slide. It's attached to the airplane. So again, be careful when you handle it. Your example might have better tolerances and it might not stick. Mine did. So be careful when you open it for the first time. But I do like the fact that the canopy does realistically slide backward just like the actual airplane does. So bravo to Panzerkampf for including that, because they could have easily just made it not open at all like the Turbo one is. And the Turbo one doesn't have a cockpit on the front either. So yeah, I would say this is definitely a major step up from that one. You do get the guns accurately modeled, the 30 millimeter cannons, the one here, and then there's two, one here and one there. So the cannons are realistically modeled. They're pretty nice. The paint's really good on them. So you get, one on each side. So you got one here, and then the cannons on the bottom there. So again, really well done there. The wing fences aren't too thick. They're sized accurately. They're not weirdly misshapen or tilted or anything like that. So in terms of detail, it's a lot of airplane, and I'm pretty glad that Panzerkampf has taken the time to build a model of this sort. So really, really happy with it in terms of the accuracy. So to kind of cover some of the cons, right now the first con I'm going to mention is the price, and by the time you watch this video it may not be a factor, but at this point in summer 2022 these things are going for about $120 to $130 shipped, which, oof, for that price, it's it's a bit dear. For $130 in the current environment, I don't think it's a bad price in the modern setup right now, but to me, this is a $79 to $89 model, and Panzerkampf's MSRP is about that price point. So at $80 to $90, it's a great deal. At $110 to $120, $130, well, that's when some of the flaws in this model start to really stand out to you, because at $130, you're about $20 away from a Caliber Wings F-14 model, and this is not at the standard of a Caliber model, I don't think. They do things differently and better than the Caliber, definitely with regards to the magnets, but is this $140, $150 worth of airplane model? No, it isn't. But that said, the fact that it is going for $130 right now is more reflective of just the general economic environment right now in summer 2022. We got, at least in the western side of things, the Russia-Ukraine war is happening. There's inflation, energy crunches, and all the general fun stuff that comes with global instability. And one of those side effects, in combination with our supply chain issues, is just higher prices for stuff around the board for everything. Groceries and gas and everything else is just it's spiking in some places. So the fact that models cost more is not really a surprise either. And for $130, I'm not sure the value is there for it. At $80 to $90, this is a must buy. At $90 to $140, you got to ask yourself how big of a Mig-19 fan you are. Because that's a bit much for this particular model. Again, this might not be a concern for you by the time that you watch this video. You watch this video in the future, by that point, these issues may have been resolved and the economy might be in a much better financial state, and this thing will be closer to MSRP in the real world where you can get these. So hopefully that's the case when you're watching this video. But right now, pricing is a little dear, and none of the Western retailers at this point have them yet, as I understand it. So you have to order these directly from China, which adds an additional few weeks to months of shipping time on top of the high price. So right now, not the easiest to get to, and that's a con just in general. It's not something that Panzerkampf really has any control over. That's just the way things are at this point. So the other con is the no cockpit, but I've mentioned that earlier, so I'll just restate it so everyone's clear on it. The other point that I want to make is that while the vents and the vent details are modeled really nicely, if you notice, they're not painted. So this vent right here, that cooling vent right here, the cooling vents over the engine maintenance cover hatches, and the intakes here, so the left and the right engine intake, those are not painted. Those are just silver finish. So to me, it detracts a little bit from the realism of the model when you just have just a silver, in this case, wall instead of black, to kind of signify that it's a cooling vent. So after this video, I'm probably going to take some black paint in a really steady hand and address those issues to my satisfaction. But just be aware that when you get these, the intake is not going to be painted, so you're just going to see it's modeled really nicely. It's modeled realistically, where you have like the curvature of the inside and everything, but the backing is just silver. It's not black to reflect that it is an intake. So it is something to note if you're looking at these. And finally, this last flaw, and it might just be something that Panzerkampf is going to address with later releases, hopefully with Pakistani ones, but there are no air-to-air missiles included with this one. It would have been nice to, and this is maybe just coloring from my experience with the KP kit. When I built my KP Mig-19, it did come with the parts to make a missile launcher. So for those of you who may not be aware, later versions of the Mig-19S had air-to-air missiles on the outrigger pylons, heat-seeking ones. So you would have either the Russian K-13s, which were copies of the AIM-9B, or you could have the AIM-9s in the case of the Pakistani J-6s. So it would have been nice to see that as an option, to just have the pylons and the missiles included, but they weren't, which again, this is a Chinese J-6 of 1960s vintage, and they didn't have air-to-air missiles at that time, so I'm willing to let that one go. But just be aware that if you are looking to buy these and you want to show it with an air-to-air missile loadout, you're not going to get that option out of the box. And the last flaw is some of the detail with the engine, like the afterburner back here. You can't see it, but the engine detail back there is a little bit less comprehensive than I'd like to see. But again, that may just be because I'm used to looking at my KP J-6, which does have some pretty good engine detail, and I mean that's kind of to be expected with a plastic model kit where you're building it. So that may just be unrealistic expectations on my part, but the engine detail on the back of this looks a little flat. But none of these flaws to me represent issues that I would say are a problem at its intended price point at $90 to $100. These are nitpicky issues. But when you're talking $130, $140 on the street, you know, you're looking at these on eBay right now for $140, and you're looking at a months-long wait. Yeah, some of these flaws might be something to pay attention to at that price, because you're cross-shopping at that point against, you know, Hobby Master F-14s or Caliber Wings F-14s, or maybe a Mig-23 from Hobby Master or some other option. So with that, I will conclude by saying that I am rather thankful to Panzerkampf for coming out with a Mig-19 model. MiGs don't seem to get much traction in the 1/72nd scale die-cast space, which is why I wound up having to build one, because hey, you know, it just seemed like the Mig-19 was kind of in that black hole purgatory place like the Mig-21 F-13 is, where just nobody wants to build a die-cast model of it. And it confuses me because the Mig-21 F-13 has quite the combat record too, but I don't know. It seems like there's some kind of secret die-cast production cartel going on, and the cartel has decreed at some council that they will never make a Mig-21 F-13 or something, because I've never seen anyone even try it. Not Corgi, not Hobby Master, no one seems to have tooled one, and it's weird to me. Because they've tooled so many other Mig-21 variants. And the Mig-21 F-13 was proliferated pretty commonly too. So I would love to see that, hint, hint, from some enterprising MiG production model company out there. But right now, with this J-6, I'm happy with it. I like what Panzerkampf has done with this. They've done a really good job of accurately capturing the Mig-19's proportions and not making errors with the length of the cockpit or the length of the intakes or the size of the airplane or scale errors or any of those types of issues that we see with other models, like with the Turbo J6 that's been out forever for like, you know, $60 or something. And honestly, it's probably not even worth considering if you care about details with these. So good job, Panzerkampf, making this. I look forward to seeing some of their other releases. I did catch on their Facebook that they're going to make an East German version, which is awesome. They're also going to do a Soviet Air Force one as well. I might get that one, because the waiting factor is I'm not paying $130 for one of these. And you know, a Soviet Air Force one, I already got a Soviet Air Force Mig-19, which is the KP kit that I built. So if I'm going to get that one, it's going to be MSRP. So we'll see how that shakes out. But they're coming out with some new ones. So if the Chinese J-6 in front of you isn't necessarily your cup of tea, keep an eye out on their Facebook page anyway, because they're probably going to come out with one of these that you will care about. They are going to release a Czechoslovak version of this, so that'll be fun. I'm glad to see the Czechoslovak people will get some recognition finally. And maybe we might see some from Panzerkampf that are of the Pakistani Air Force and the Egyptian Air Force and you know, and Vietnamese Air Force, hopefully, because that would be cool. The Mig-19 in Vietnamese service was actually a pretty active aircraft for the brief time that it served towards the end of the Rolling Thunder campaign in the late 60s. So big stories there, and I look forward to seeing Panzerkampf's future releases for this, and hopefully you are too. So if you're looking at picking up one of these, I do recommend doing so. At $130, it's a little stiff, but if you're a fan of MiG-19s, I would say go for it. You'll enjoy it, and if it's to a point where the MSRP starts being more and more attainable, and we can get these between $90 and $100 on the street, it's a compelling no-brainer option. So thank you for watching this review of the Mig-19. Please leave your questions and comments in the section below, and to stay notified when I release a new video, or to just indicate in general how good of a job that you feel I'm doing, please subscribe. Just consider it. And That way you'll know when I release a new one. I'm going to make an effort to stick to a weekly release cycle on Sundays. So if you are a subscriber, you will get that notification in your YouTube inbox, and you'll know when I publish a new one. So thank you again for watching. Your support is greatly appreciated, and I'm very grateful for that. And have a good one, modelers.